Okay. I had some students email me about exam two this week. Exam two is going to open Thursday morning and close Friday night. So you have a 2-day window to take that test. And I had a couple of people email me because they would like a little bit more review over for loops and a little bit more review over functions. So the three big topics for exam two are going to be for loops, while loops, and functions, and it's very heavy on functions. So I just wanted to make kind of a short video here where I go through and do some examples of those things. So the first question that someone had was about for loops, similar to what we did for program three. In program three, we did something called a for each loop, where you basically said if you have a collection of items, a for each loop says iterate through that collection and grab each item in the collection one at a time. So I'll show you an example of that. Let's say you had some kind of collection. So maybe I have a list here of colors, and the items inside of colors are just going to be red, blue, green, yellow, whatever. It doesn't really matter what we're putting inside of this. It's just that this is a collection of items, and it's all stored inside of colors. You don't need to know how to write lists or anything like that. I'm just trying to illustrate the for loop that we would use to go through each of these items one at a time. So if we had something like for color in colors, oops, my bad, in colors. My shift key has been sticking on my laptop here. Some things that I would like you to know. In this case, for is a reserved word. That's going to look the same for everybody. That's saying that this is a for loop. And this is just a placeholder. This is just a name that I made up. You could have named it anything that you wanted. And as a reserved word, it has to be written just like that. And then this is just a name. So I made up color and colors. Those are just for this example. The syntax, the kind of setup of it would be the same for any for each loop. We're saying for each item in this list of items. Then what do I want to do with it? Let's say that we just printed them out just to kind of illustrate what this is doing. So this just says go through, grab each item inside that collection of items and just print them out one at a time. You do not need to know how a for each loop works for exam two. That's not going to be on the test. The only for loop questions on the test are going to be range questions for, some value. It's usually I in range. And you need to know how it works for 1 parameter, 2 parameters, and 3 parameters. The only reason I am showing you this example is because I had a student say that they didn't really feel comfortable with writing for each loops. They didn't feel confident in that knowledge. And because we had done it for program 3, I wanted to show you an example of using it. So that is just saying going through each item one at a time. Examples that you could potentially need to know for exam 2. We want to know how a for range loop works with, again, that shift key, sorry, works for 1 parameter, just one number, 2 numbers, and 3 numbers. So here's an example of a for loop where I am telling you to go through a range of numbers. In this case, we write I in a lot of the examples, but it doesn't have to be I. We could have called this anything we wanted. This is just some variable that we made up. This is just some placeholder. Like, it doesn't matter what you call it. So it says for, go through the numbers within the range. If you only give it one number, it's going to give back out to you 0 up to that number. And it's non-inclusive. You don't include the value that you gave it. So this example would start at 0 and it would go up to 10 and it would not include the 10. So if we run this, it prints out the numbers 0 through 9. Okay. So that's an example with one parameter, 0 up to the number that you gave it. The other way that we might potentially do this is we might give it two numbers. And if we give it two numbers, the first one is where you start, and the second one is where you stop. And so the difference between this loop and the one that I just ran, you can kind of see the two outputs compared here. If I don't specify where to start, it's going to start at 0. If I specifically tell it where I want it to start, that's where it will begin. It will still run up to that stopping point, and it will still not include the stopping point, okay? So notice that like 10 didn't get printed out on either one of these examples. Okay. The third way that you can do it is you could have the third parameter. So here we would have, where do you start? Where do you stop? And then the third one would be, some people call it a step, some people call it an increment. It's how much are you changing by each time you move, like to the next. This is your loop control variable. And so your step or your increment is saying how much are you changing this loop control variable every time you go through a new iteration of the loop. So let's say, for example, I wanted to print out the numbers from 1 to 100, but I want to go by tens. I want to skip by 10 every time. This would start at 1, and then it would add 10. It would print out 11. And then it would add 10. It would, print out 21, and it would go all the way down to 100. It would not include the 100. So the last number I would print out, I think, would be like 90, 91. We'll run it and see. So go through these values, print them out so we can see what it's doing. So I start at 1. I am incrementing by 10. What's the difference between each one of these values? How much did I add to that loop control variable? And it's not always an add. We could have given it a negative number. We could have done a decrement instead of an increment. We could have gone down and subtracted instead of going up and adding. But the question is, what's the change? What's the difference between what you started at? How do you want to change it for the next iteration of the loop? Do that over and over again until you get up to that stopping value, that ending value. Okay. So those are the 3 types of for loops that you want to know for the exam. Only range ones know for each questions, and know how to do it with 1, 2, and 3. Know what those different numbers would mean and what they would stand for. So the next thing I would like to give you a little more practice with is functions. Let's talk about some more functions for a second. For functions, you should know appropriate function calls. If I gave you code with a function, you should be able to read through it and tell me what the output would be. I could ask you to write a short function yourself, and those questions will be very similar to the quiz over functions, very similar. So you want to go back and look at those quizzes because the questions will be a lot like that. And then specifically, you want to know about the word return. What does that reserved word return mean? What does it do? And how does it change the way the function works? So let's take a look. If you are writing a function yourself, you're going to use def. Def is short for define. We're just going to zoom in a little bit here. And then you give it a name. So remember that when you make a function, you are making a set of instructions. And I want to be able to just refer to it as a name so I can ask someone, go do these tasks, without having to specifically say every single individual task that I want you to do every time I ask you to go complete this. So imagine that you are a baker and you are running a bakery and you need to be able to tell an employee, go make a loaf of bread. You do not want to have to individually say, go turn on the oven, go mix these ingredients, go get this pan. cook this for this temperature at this time. For, you don't want to have to say every single individual task. You want to be able to just give the instruction, go bake the bread. And then every time you say that, you want someone to understand what is every step that needs to be taken to be able to complete that. That's what we're doing. We are saying, I'm going to create a task, a group of instructions. I'm going to give it a name, bake bread, so that every time I want somebody to do it, I can just call it by that name and they can go follow those tasks and I can have it, done over and over again without having to spell out every single little step every time I want it done. So we are going to write a function that's just going to say hello. And it's going to say hello to the user. Whatever name we pass to it, we want it to say hello to that name. So when you write a function, you use the reserved word def. Def is short for define. I'm defining what I want you to do when I ask you to say hello. If you are going to say hello to a specific person's name, you need to know what that person's name is. So inside the parentheses, you put what input does this function need to be able to accomplish the task that you asked for it, right? If you tell somebody, go make bread, maybe the baker needs to know, how many loaves do you want? That's information that it needs in to be able to accomplish the task. So here we are going to just input a name. And I'm just going to say, I want you to print hello and that name. So they can enter in whatever they want for this input information. And then the instructions that I'm going to give it to do is to just print out the word hello and concatenate that with whatever they entered in for name, whatever input they gave me. So this is my function. Now I'm down here outside of the function because I'm no longer indented, so I'm not in the function anymore. And I could call this hello function over and over again as many times as I wanted. Hello, Micah. Hello, John. Hello, Sarah. Like, it doesn't matter. You can call it as many times as you want. You can give it as many different inputs as you want. It doesn't matter. If I run this, it's going to go do these instructions, take the input that you gave me, insert it here, use it here. So I've got the three, outputs of those three function calls. Great, easy peasy. Here are some common mistakes that people make, that I see made with things like this. If I say something like write a function that will print out a name, or if I say what would be an appropriate function call that's going to print out a name, very often I see somebody do something like this. We think, it's logical. It's an easy assumption to make. We think that if we want the result of this to be printed out, that we need to tell the computer to print this function, the output of this function. You do not need to do that. You have a print command in the function already. The instructions already tell it to go print out that result. That's fine. If I ask the computer, if I put this here and ask it to print it, look at what it does. It prints out none, which, it might not really be clear. Why is it doing that? The way this command is working, what we are really asking the computer to do is we are saying, go do these instructions, and then whatever answer it returns back to you, whatever result of its operation it sends back to you, that's what I want to print out. This function did not return any values. There is no return command written here. So that's why it's printing out none, because it's saying, go do these operations. What answer did you send back to me? That's what I'm going to print. Well, we didn't send any answer back out at all. So this would not be a logical function call. This would not make any sense. I don't want to print the result of a function that is a, whoops, that is a non-fruitful function. I don't want to print something that does not have the literal word return in the function itself. Let's look at an example that does have that. I'm just going to do one example because it's unnecessary to have so many of those. So let's say that we asked a function to do some calculation, do some math, get an answer, return the result back to me. So let's say we did something like double. We're going to give it a value, some input x, and then I want you to return whatever input you gave me, x times 2. So this turned blue, right? This is a reserved word. This is a command that we are giving the computer. We say, I want you to do this operation, and I want you to take the result and return it back to wherever we call the function double. So if I come down here and I just call it, let's say I just call the function double 8. What happens when I run this? It still prints the hello Micah. It doesn't print out any answer at all. It ran this code. There are no errors with this. It did, it's not that like it didn't print it out because the computer didn't do it. It did it. It says double 8. All right. I come up here to my instructions. I'm going to take the value 8. I'm going to multiply it by 2. Okay, the answer is 16. I return that answer back out. We put a 16 here. The reason nothing gets printed onto the console is because we didn't do anything with the answer, right? If you are returning a value back out from the function, you should do something with that value. You should either print it out to the console so that we can see the answer, or you should store it in a variable. Maybe you're going to do something with it later. Maybe you're going to use it in an expression, or you're going to print it from the variable later or something like that. But you should do something with the answer so that you can actually see the result. So here, it does make sense to put this function call inside of the print command. Here we say, go do these instructions. Okay, I did. Return the answer back out right here to where you got called. Print that answer, the answer that you returned out to me. Now, even though, my function didn't change and my call didn't change, now I can actually see the result of what it did because I printed it. We could store that in an answer somewhere, right? We could say num equals double, 3, print num. So here we ask the computer to call this function. We take the answer that it returns back out to us and we store it inside of num. So now I have the result somewhere in my code. It is saved somewhere in my code, so I could do something with it later. If I ask the computer to print out num, it has the value of 6 inside of it because it stored that answer that got returned back out from the function call. Okay. So when can you print or store a function call? When you have a return, when it is a fruitful function. It would not make sense to try to print or store a function call like this one up here, a non-fruitful function that does not have a return in it, because it's not sending a result back to this function call, to where it got called and used inside of your main. Okay. The only other thing is going to be your input parameters. You need to make sure that the input parameters match. So here we said that we would pass in a single variable. So I had to pass in some variable whenever I called it. In this example, I had 1. So notice how everywhere that I called it, I had 1. If we had an example of a function that did not need any input, It's just going to print out, hello, and that's it. We don't need any input at all. If there is no input parameter here, there should be no input parameter here. They need to match. So now it works fine. It's happy. Did you notice that as I was deleting things over here, let me go back. Did you notice it has the red and green line? Because my instructions say that when you call hello, I don't need any input. I don't take any information, right? These are just empty parentheses. But then that's not how I tried to call it. So when you try to call a function, you call it by its name, and the names have to match exactly. And also the input parameters that you try to give it inside the parentheses have to match. So here we have none. Here we should have. Okay. The angry red lines went away whenever I deleted that. Okay, so we did appropriate function calls, reading through one, the word return, what does it do? Let's say I asked you to write a function yourself. So let's say I said to write a function. We've done this example a couple of times. Write a function that will accept two numbers as input and return the smaller number. I think that was a question on the quiz that we just took. Notice that it says return. You should literally write return. If the instructions say to calculate something and print the answer, then just go ahead and print the answer. But pay attention to your instructions because they need to match. They need to do exactly what it, print and return are two different commands, and they are doing two different things. So you want to make sure that you're correctly matching what the question is asking you to do. So maybe just, pause the video, try writing this yourself, see if you would be able to do this on your own. And then maybe come back and watch it and see if you got it correct. And there's more than one correct way to do it. I am wanting you to write it using if statements, like the logic that we have learned in class. You could do it with men and, Max, people did that on previous quizzes, but that's not really what I'm looking for this question. So please just go ahead and use stuff that we've talked about in the class whenever you're answering like an exam question. So write a function. So right off the bat, you should have the word def, right? If you can't figure out the logic, write down the word def. You'll at least get some sort of credit. Next, you need to give the instructions a name. It doesn't really matter what you call it. There are some variable naming rules and some like function naming rules, but I'm not going to be super picky about that. That's fine. And it tells you right here in the instructions that it needs two numbers as the input, and input go inside our parentheses. Okay. I want to return the smaller number, so I need some conditional statements here. I need to know which one is smaller. So if x is less than y, x would be my smaller number. I want to literally say return because that's what's in the instructions. Otherwise, if that's not the case, then I will return y. And in this case, I'm returning y even if they match. But if I say, 3 and 3, what's the smaller number? 3. So even though this is going to return them if they are equal, not necessarily just less than, that would be the correct answer anyway, so it's fine. If you were to try and call this function, what would you want to do? You would call it by its name. You would have to give it two inputs. And then because we have that return, I should do something with the return. If I just call the function, I don't see anything. It found the answer and then it just threw it in the trash. What was the point? So it makes more sense for me to either print that result or store that result, one of the two. So now it is correctly returning the smaller number out of the two that I gave it. So I feel happy with that. Indentation does matter. I have been taking off some points on quizzes in exam 1 for people not tabbing over. In some languages, it doesn't matter, like, the computer doesn't care about white space, but in Python, tabbing over and indenting is how you tell the computer that this is part of the function, and it's how I tell the computer that this is part of my if statement. If you don't show me any indentation at all on your quiz or exam, I really can't even read your code because I can't tell what you intended to be part of your loop, part of your function, part of your, if statement. Like I don't know if you don't at least just put a space or something. So that is part of the answer being correct for Python code. Please be mindful of that when you're typing out your responses. I believe that that is everything that people had questions about, and that they specifically asked me to cover. If you do not feel comfortable with anything else, if there's something you would like me to do an example for, please email me. You could come into my office hours. I'll be in my office Thursday afternoon and Friday afternoon. If you want to come by and ask some questions before taking the test, that would be fine. And please remember that there are questions on the exam that I have to manually grade. So when you first finish the test and you see your grade, that's not your real grade, right? Anything where it asks you to type stuff in, I have to go through and put that in myself. So the first grade that you see will only be the auto graded portion. And if you'll just try and maybe wait like a day or two, I should get those in over the weekend. You should be able to see your final grade by like Monday morning at the latest. Right. That's all that I have. Thank you. Good luck to everybody. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.